The dress was wrong. Sadie noticed it before she noticed anything else. The way the seam along the left shoulder had been stitched just slightly too tight, pulling the fabric against her collarbone in a way that would leave a mark by evening. She had sewn it herself, 3 weeks ago, working by candlelight until her fingers bled. She had been so careful. And still, something was wrong. She should have taken it as a sign. The great hall of Ashenvale Keep had been transformed overnight. Whoever had ordered the decorations understood power, not celebration. Every banner was deep crimson, every candle thick and white, every surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected the flames back doubled. The hall smelled of pine resin and melted beeswax, and something underneath both. Something animal and sharp that only the shifters in the room could fully identify. Sadie was not a shifter. She noticed the smell the way a person notices thunder before rain, as a warning she did not yet have language for. She moved through the corridor outside the hall with her head down and her tray balanced. 2 silver pitchers of mulled wine, 4 goblets, a linen cloth folded precisely at the edge. She had been carrying trays through these corridors for 4 years. She knew which flagstones were uneven, which torches burned too hot, which guard would let her pass without making her stop and justify herself. She knew the geography of invisibility. That was what she was here. Invisible. The other maids called it a gift. You have the kind of face people look through, Marta had told her once. Not unkindly, just plainly, the way Marta said everything. That's useful. Better than being noticed in a place like this. Sadie had learned not to argue with that. She was 23 years old, born outside the Pack territories, brought to Ashenvale as a girl when her mother took a position in the laundry, and died 2 winters later of a fever that no healer was summoned to treat. Since then, Sadie had worked. She cleaned, she carried, she mended, she pressed, she polished. She learned quickly, kept her head down, and earned a reputation for competence and silence that meant she was given the more sensitive assignments. The private floors, the council anteroom, the guest chambers of important visitors. Not because anyone liked her. Because she was safe. Because she would not talk. Today she had been assigned to the ceremony of ascension. The Alpha King was coming. Evander of the Northern Reaches. She had heard the name her entire life, the way everyone in the shifter territories heard it, as something between myth and weather. He had held the Alpha Kingship for 11 years. He had ended 3 territorial wars. He had dissolved 2 corrupt councils and executed 1 pack lord for crimes against unmated females that no one wanted to name aloud. He was described in different ways by different people. Ruthless, fair, cold, decisive, enormous, controlled. Every description agreed on one thing. When Evander walked into a room, something in the room changed. Sadie did not expect to be anywhere near him. Her assignment was the outer corridor service, keeping the side tables supplied during the ceremony, so that the senior staff could focus on the formal presentation. She would be in the same hall, yes. She would be invisible, yes. That was all. She pushed through the servants' door into the main corridor, turned left toward the hall entrance, and almost walked into Lord Fenwick's chest. She stopped, adjusted the tray, kept her eyes down. Fenwick was the Lord Steward of Ashenvale, the man who had inherited the keep's administration when the previous lord died without heirs, and who had spent the last 7 years making himself indispensable enough that no one questioned his authority. He was not a large man, but he occupied space in the way of someone who had spent decades practicing the impression of size. He wore the house colors tonight, dark green and silver, his chain of office gleaming against his collar. He smelled of clove and something else, something underneath that Sadie's human nose could not name, but her instincts recoiled from. He was not alone. 2 men stood with him in the alcove off the corridor, positioned the way men stood when they did not want to be seen. One was a guard captain whose name Sadie did not know. The other was a healer. She recognized him by his satchel and his gray coat, a man called Renfrew, who worked the lower floors and had a reputation for asking no questions. They were speaking quietly. She would have passed without listening. She was good at that. Walking past conversations, eyes forward, brain closed. It was survival technique as much as courtesy. But Fennec said a name, Evander, and then, by the third oration. That's when the configuration is correct. The king will be facing west. The guard formation will have the standard gap at the eastern flank. 5 men, not 6. 5 is enough if they move simultaneously, and they will. Sadie's feet stopped moving. She did not decide to stop. Her body made the decision without asking her. The tray stayed level. Her face stayed blank. But every nerve she had went completely, terribly still. Renfrew said something she almost missed. And the tincture, already administered. Fenwick's voice was quiet and satisfied, the way a man sounds when the hard part is already done. In the preparation wine. He drank from it 20 minutes ago. It won't be enough to drop him, but it will slow his reaction time, just enough. What about the girl? That was the guard captain. What girl? The maid. The little quiet one they put on corridor service. She circles the hall every quarter hour. A pause. Then Fenwick, with the particular disinterest of a man dismissing a piece of furniture. She won't be paying attention to anything that matters. None of them do. The 3 men moved. The alcove emptied. The corridor was quiet again. Sadie stood in the middle of it alone with 2 pitchers of mulled wine and a folded linen cloth, and the specific, crystalline understanding that in less than 1 hour, 5 men were going to try to kill the Alpha King during a ceremony he had come to attend in peace, that his wine had been dosed with something to slow him, that the guard formation had been deliberately configured to give assassins an opening, and that Lord Fenwick, the man who ran this keep, who signed her work assignments, who had once told her she was the most reliable member of the lower staff, had just described her as something that did not require attention. Her hands were steady. She did not know why. Everything else inside her was shaking. She had grown up in the gaps of this world. She had learned things in those gaps that no one had taught her. How to read a room before entering it, how to gauge danger by the set of a man's shoulders, how to become so small and quiet that information flowed around her like water around stone. She had learned, very young, that people who dismissed her were also people who forgot to watch her. She was not a fighter. She was not a shifter. She did not have claws or a wolf or speed that exceeded a human's natural limits. She had 4 years of navigating this keep in silence, a mind that catalogued everything it observed, and the knowledge that in roughly 50 minutes, a man who had ended 3 wars and dissolved 2 corrupt councils was going to be attacked from behind, while his reaction time had been chemically dulled. She turned and walked back the way she had come, not running. Running drew eyes. She had one advantage, and it was the only advantage she had ever had. Nobody was watching her. The servants' passage behind the east wall of the great hall ran the full length of the room, with 3 observation slats cut into the stone at intervals, designed originally for the steward's use, for monitoring the hall without being present in it. Sadie had discovered them 2 years ago, while chasing a mouse that had gotten into the linen stores. She had never mentioned them to anyone. She pressed her eye to the first slat now, and looked into the hall. The ceremony had begun. He was easier to identify than she expected. Not because of his size, though he was large, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested not bulk, but density. The particular physical quality of someone whose power was structural rather than decorative. Not because of his bearing, though that was unmistakable, because of the quality of stillness around him. Everyone else in the hall was performing. The lords and their attendants were angled outward, arranged for observation. Evander stood the way a mountain stood, not for the benefit of anyone watching, simply there, occupying his ground. He wore no crown. A dark wool coat, military in cut, with a narrow insignia at the collar she could not read from this distance. He was listening to the first oration with the particular attention of someone who had learned to watch without appearing to. His eyes moved in a pattern she recognized, not the wandering gaze of boredom, but the systematic scan of someone assessing a room. He had noticed the guard configuration, she thought. He was the kind of man who would have noticed, but the tincture in his wine, that, he would not have been able to see. She counted the guards visible from her position. Standard formation. Eastern flank, exactly as Fenwick had described. A gap of roughly 4 body lengths between the last guard and the wall, obscured by a tapestry and a candelabra that had been moved. She had moved it herself this morning, on Fenwick's instruction, believing it was for the decorations. The nausea of that realization moved through her quickly. She allowed herself 3 seconds for it. Then she set it aside. There were 2 options available to her. She could find someone to tell, but Fenwick controlled the guard, controlled the senior staff, and she had no way to determine who else was part of the arrangement and who was not. A wrong choice meant she would be quietly removed before she reached the hall. Option 2. She could act alone. She was a maid with a tray and a linen cloth. She was also the only person in this keep who knew what was about to happen and was not involved in making it happen. The first oration was ending. The second would follow. Then the third. She left the passage at a run. She knew the keep the way she knew her own breathing. Every door, every shortcut, every passage that existed between the official architecture and the real one, the one made of servants' corridors and forgotten staircases, and rooms that had changed purpose 3 times over the decades, without anyone updating the floor plans. Sadie moved through that second keep now, at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything short of it. Her skirts gathered in one fist, her soft-soled shoes silent on the stone. She needed 2 things. She needed to reach the hall before the third oration ended, and she needed a reason to be near the Alpha King that would not get her stopped by the guards Fenwick controlled. The tray. She still had the tray. She ducked into the service alcove beside the main kitchen passage, set down the mulled wine pitchers, and replaced them with the water service that sat prepared for the post-ceremony refreshment. A single tall crystal pitcher, cold, and 4 clean goblets. More formal, more appropriate for the ceremony space itself. A reason to approach the head table rather than the side tables. A reason that would look, to any watching guard, like she was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Her hands moved through the motions automatically while her mind worked the problem. 5 men, moving simultaneously at the eastern flank gap. She could not stop 5 men. She was not built to stop 5 men. But she did not need to stop them. She needed to collapse the geometry of the plan. Fenwick's arrangement depended on precise timing, precise positioning, and a king whose reflexes had been dulled enough to give the attackers a 2-second advantage. Remove one of those elements and the whole structure weakened. She could not restore Evander's reaction time. She could not move 5 men. But she could move the king. Which meant she needed to reach him before the third oration ended. Say something that would make him step away from his position, and do it in a way that didn't alert the men who were watching. She straightened her dress, settled the tray, and walked toward the hall's main entrance. The guard at the door was a man called Oswin. She had seen him on this post for 2 years, had brought him water on hot days and broth when he was ill the previous winter. He was not part of Fenwick's arrangement. She was nearly certain of that. He was too young and too honestly bored to be carrying a conspiracy. He looked at her tray and looked at her face and opened the door. She went in. The second oration was halfway through. The hall was full. 40, perhaps 50 people arranged in the formal configuration of a ceremony of ascension, which meant witnesses from 6 territories, representatives of 3 vassal pacts, 3 senior lords of the keep's own council, and a formal guard of 12. The candles were lit in their full array now, and the room smelled of hot wax and the pine resin from the decorative boughs, and underneath all of it that sharp animal undercurrent that intensified with this many shifters in a formal gathering. Sadie kept her eyes on the side tables and her feet on the servants' path, the narrow strip of floor along the western wall that was understood by everyone in every hall she had ever worked to be the invisible road. You could walk it and be not quite present. She had walked it 1,000 times. She was 3/4 of the way down the hall when she let herself look. Evander was standing at the head of the formal arrangement, slightly apart from the lords flanking him in the way of a man who does not require proximity to feel secure. The orator, an elderly lord from the central territories she did not recognize, stood at the lectern with his notes. The third oration was next. She had perhaps 6 minutes. She needed to reach the king. She needed to cross the invisible line between the servants' road and the formal floor, approach the Alpha King mid-ceremony, and say something to him privately without it appearing to be an alarm. She had spent 4 years being overlooked. Now she needed that invisibility to work in a very specific, very precise way. She needed to be seen by him, and not seen by the guards who were watching for disruptions. She reached the end of the western wall, turned at the corner as if heading for the service door, and instead stepped directly into the formal floor. The shift was immediate. A guard near the eastern wall straightened. A lord's attendant turned. She felt the eyes find her the way you feel a change in temperature, not warmly. She kept walking, tray level, face composed. She angled not toward the main table, but toward the small refreshment stand beside it, the one that existed for exactly this purpose, and she moved with the specific, unhurried certainty of someone who had been sent on this errand by someone important. She reached the stand, set down one goblet, poured water with a steady hand, looked up. He was 6 feet away. Up close, the quality of stillness she had observed through the slat was different. It was not passivity. It was the stillness of something that had learned that movement was a choice, not a reflex, that everything it did was deliberate. His eyes were already on her, not because she had startled him, because he had been watching the room in that systematic way, and she had walked into his field of attention, and he had simply not looked away. He had noticed her cross the invisible line. She was certain of it. She set down the second goblet, kept her voice below the level of the oration, which was still filling the room with the formal cadences of territorial law. My lord. She did not use the formal title. Formal titles required a pause, required a response. She needed this to look like a servant's murmur, routine and forgettable. There is a matter with the eastern arrangement. Lord Fenwick asked me to request that you step to the western side for the third oration. Something about the acoustics. It was a terrible lie. She knew it was a terrible lie the moment she said it. Fenwick would never send a maid to redirect the Alpha King on a matter of ceremony acoustics. No one would. It was precisely the kind of errand that did not exist. Evander looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her, with the full attention of someone who had heard exactly what she said and was now reading something much larger than the words. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only she could hear it. It was not the voice she had imagined from the stories. It was quieter, more precise. Fenwick sent you. Yes, she said. The lie sat in the air between them, and she watched him look at it. Fenwick, he said again, with the particular flatness of a man filing information away rather than reacting to it, does not send maids to manage ceremony positioning. No, she said, he doesn't. A pause. The second oration reached its formal closing phrase. In the movement of people repositioning for the third, in the small shift of the room's attention, Evander turned slightly toward her, not away from the ceremony, not enough to be noticed, just enough to be precise. His eyes had not changed. There was no alarm in them, no urgency. There was something more unsettling. Complete attention. Tell me what you actually know, he said. She told him. 14 seconds, because that was all she had. 5 men, eastern flank, the gap behind the tapestry, the tincture in the preparation wine, the guard captain, Renfrew the healer. She said it the way she had learned to say difficult things in this keep, without inflection, without pause, as if she were reciting a supply list. Because the moment her voice shook, someone nearby would hear it as distress, and distressed servants drew attention. When she finished, Evander was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Which tapestry?" "The hunting scene, second from the eastern door." He looked at the tray in her hands, then at her face. There was something in the way he did it, not assessing her fear, but assessing her accuracy. As if the important question was not, "Are you frightened?" but "Are you right?" "Stay on the western wall," he said. "Do not move toward the eastern side regardless of what happens. Do you understand?" "Yes. Your name." She hesitated for half a second, which she immediately recognized as the single most useless hesitation of her life. "Sadie." He looked at her for 1 moment more. Not long, not dramatic, just the look of a man confirming a piece of information, and then turned back to the ceremony as the third orator took the lectern. Sadie walked back to the western wall, set down her tray on the side table, pressed her back against the cold stone and watched. What happened next took less than 90 seconds and rearranged everything she thought she understood about power. Evander did not move dramatically. He did not call for guards or raise his voice or do anything that could be described as a reaction. He simply, in the natural movement of the ceremony, repositioned himself 2 steps to the left, away from the eastern flank, toward the center of the formal arrangement, in a way that looked like nothing more than a lord adjusting his stance during a long oration. The 5 men came from behind the hunting tapestry, exactly as Fenwick had arranged. They came into a space that was empty. The gap in the guard formation that had been designed to let them through had been, in the 30 seconds before they moved, quietly closed. Not by a shouted order, not by visible alarm, but by 2 of Evander's own men who had been in the hall the entire time, positioned as attendants, who moved to the eastern wall with the unhurried efficiency of people who had been told exactly where to stand and when. The 5 men emerged from behind the tapestry and found themselves surrounded before they had taken 4 steps. There was a moment, brief, absolute, where the hall understood what had almost happened. The orator stopped mid-sentence. The lords went still. The guards who had been part of Fenwick's arrangement looked at each other with the specific expression of men whose plan has become a trap. Evander's voice filled the hall without being raised. "Lord Fenwick." Fenwick was standing near the northern wall. He did not move. His face had gone the color of old candle wax. "Stand where you are," Evander said. Still quiet, still precise. It was not a request. It was the kind of instruction that did not need volume, because it did not occur to anyone in the room to disobey it. From her place against the western wall, tray still in her hands, Sadie watched Fenwick's expression move through something she had never seen on his face before. The end of a certainty. He had spent 7 years being indispensable. He had built a structure of control so thorough that he had stopped imagining what it looked like from outside it. He had sent a maid on corridor service because she was furniture, and the furniture had dismantled him in 14 seconds. He looked across the hall. He found her. The look on his face was not anger. It was something more precise and more terrible than anger. It was the specific expression of a man recalculating, too late, everything he had dismissed. Sadie met his eyes and did not look away. She was shaking now. Finally, properly shaking, the kind that came after rather than during, when the body caught up to what the mind had already processed. But she did not lower her gaze. She had spent 4 years being looked through, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of being right about her at the end. They took Fenwick out of the hall in silence. No chains, no shouting, no spectacle. 2 of Evander's men walked to either side of him, and Fenwick went with them the way a man goes when he understands that resistance is a different kind of surrender. The 5 attackers were restrained near the eastern wall. The guard captain was separated from the others. Renfrew the healer was found in the anteroom before he could reach the servants' exit, his satchel still in hand, and brought back into the hall without ceremony. The lords and witnesses stood in a silence that had the particular texture of people reassessing everything they had observed in the last hour and arriving at conclusions that unsettled them. Evander spoke to his senior man, a broad, weathered figure who had appeared from somewhere in the formal crowd without Sadie being able to identify the moment he arrived, in a low voice for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned and surveyed the hall with the unhurried calm of someone conducting an inventory. His eyes moved through the room in that systematic way she had observed through the slat, settling briefly on each element that required attention. They settled on her. She was still against the western wall. The tray was still in her hands. She had not moved, because no one had told her to move, and because, honestly, she was not entirely certain her legs would carry her anywhere with dignity. The shaking had moved inward now, not visible, just a deep internal tremor that she recognized as the after-effect of sustained fear, the kind that waited politely until the crisis was resolved, and then arrived all at once. One of Evander's men crossed the hall toward her. Not the weathered senior man, a younger one, precise and quiet, with the particular quality of movement that marked a shifter who had learned to modulate his speed around humans. "The king requests your presence," he said. It was not a question. She set the tray on the side table, carefully, because the instinct to be careful with the silver did not apparently stop functioning even during a political crisis, and followed him. The room they brought her to was off the main corridor, one of the keep's formal receiving chambers. She knew it well. She had cleaned it every third day for 2 years. The small writing desk in the corner had a drawer that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly before pulling, and the window latch on the left side had been repaired poorly and let in a draft when the wind came from the north. She had reported it twice. Nothing had been done. Evander was already there when she entered. He had removed the formal coat. It was folded over the back of the chair, and stood in the dark wool of the undershirt and the close-fitted trousers of the military cut she had observed from the hall. Without the formal layer, he looked, if anything, more substantial. There was a lantern on the desk and a candle near the window, and the room smelled of cold stone and wood smoke from the corridor, and faintly, beneath those things, something that she could not identify, but that her nervous system registered as steady, as safe. She distrusted the sensation immediately. Her instincts had been wrong before. He gestured toward the chair across the desk. She sat. He remained standing, but not in the way of someone establishing hierarchy, in the way of someone who simply stood more naturally than he sat. There was a cup of water on the desk near her. She did not know how it had gotten there. She did not touch it. "You work corridor service," he said. "Yes." "How long have you been assigned to this keep?" 4 years. "And before that?" "The laundry. My mother worked there. She died when I was 19. I transferred to the upper floors afterward." She gave the information plainly, without apology. It was not a shameful history. It was simply a history. He nodded slowly. "You said the preparation wine. You're certain?" Renfrew was carrying a satchel with a particular kind of vial, dark glass, sealed with wax, the color they use for tinctures meant to be added to liquids rather than taken directly. "I've seen that type of vial in the lower stores when the healers do their quarterly inventory. Whatever was in it was already in the preparation wine when it was brought to you. Fenwick said you drank from it 20 minutes before I found them in the alcove." Evander was quiet for a moment. "You observed all of that in the corridor." "I wasn't supposed to be listening," she said. "I was passing through. They were standing in the alcove and I almost walked into Lord Fenwick and I heard your name and I stopped." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I heard them say 5 men and simultaneous and the gap in the Eastern Guard formation, and I understood what it meant. Most people," he said, "would have kept walking. Most people," she said, "would have had somewhere else to be." it came out more plainly than she intended. Not bitterness, just fact. She had nowhere else to be. No family in the keep, no pack, no mate, no particular person who would notice if she walked past a conspiracy and let it proceed. She had only the knowledge of what she had heard, and the 4 years of watching this keep operate from its invisible roads. She had used what she had. Evander looked at her for a long moment. Not with pity. She was grateful for that. She had received enough pity in this keep to last several lifetimes, and none of it had ever helped her with anything. The tincture Fenwick described, he said, would take roughly 4 hours to clear my system fully. My men will manage the formal proceedings. You will remain in this keep tonight, not in the servants' quarters. I'll have a room prepared on the secure floor. He said it the way he said everything, as a settled matter rather than a proposal. She felt the resistance move through her immediately. It was not ingratitude. It was the specific, practiced wariness of someone who had learned that when powerful people took sudden interest in you, the interest was rarely about you. I don't need a different room, she said. I need to know whether Lord Fenwick's arrest changes my assignment. If the senior staff are being questioned, someone needs to maintain the corridor service or the evening meal won't. Sadie. He said her name the way he had said it in the hall, not as a softening, not as a command, just as a precise identification. She stopped. Fenwick knew your schedule, he said. He knew your patrol pattern. He placed you specifically on corridor service tonight because he had calculated when you would and would not be in the hall. You were a variable he had accounted for. A pause. That means at least one person on the senior staff gave him information about your movements. Until we know who, the servants' quarters are not secure for you. She had not thought of it that way. She thought of it now, and the thought was cold and specific. The understanding that her invisibility had not only failed to protect her tonight, but had been used as a tool by the man who had built the conspiracy. She had been so confident in her ability to disappear. And Fenwick had mapped her disappearances into his plan. All right, she said. The room they gave her was on the 3rd floor of the keep's north wing, which was the floor Sadie had cleaned for 4 years and knew in the same bone-deep way she knew everything else about this building. The irony of being housed as a guest on the floor where she had changed linen and carried ash from fireplaces was not lost on her. She didn't know what to do with it, so she set it aside. The room itself was spare, but well-appointed. A bed with a carved headboard and a dark green coverlet, a washstand with clean water already in the basin, a low fire in the hearth that someone had started recently. It smelled of the lavender sachets she herself had placed in the linen press 2 weeks ago. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the fire and allowed herself, for the first time since the corridor, to feel the full weight of the evening. She had stopped an assassination. She had crossed the invisible line in the middle of a formal ceremony and spoken directly to the Alpha King and been believed. Fenwick, Lord Fenwick, who had run this keep for 7 years, who had signed her work assignments and dismissed her as furniture, was in custody because she had heard 14 seconds of a conversation she was not meant to hear. She should have felt something triumphant. She felt instead exhausted and slightly sick. And underneath both of those things, a new and unwelcome awareness that the life she had built here, small, invisible, functional, had been fundamentally altered in ways she could not yet measure. A knock at the door. She stood, habit pulling her upright automatically. It was the quiet young man who had brought her to Evander. He carried a covered tray, actual food, not the servant's meal she would normally have taken in the lower hall. Bread and something warm. A small pot of something that smelled of herbs and broth. From the king, he said, and set it on the table near the window, and left. She looked at the tray for a long moment. Then she sat down and ate, because she was hungry, and because refusing it would have been a form of pride she could not afford. The bread was good. The broth was better. She ate all of it. Outside the window, The forest beyond the keep's wall was dark and dense and motionless. The wind had died. The night was the particular still cold of early autumn in the mountain territories, when the temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the stars came out hard and bright against the black sky. She had looked out of these windows 100 times while changing linen. It looked different from this side of the glass. She was still sitting at the table, looking out at the dark trees when she heard it. Not with her ears, but with the part of her that had always noticed things before she had words for them. A shift in the quality of the silence outside her door. Not a threat. Something else. Something that had stopped moving and was simply present. She looked at the door. The gap beneath it showed light from the corridor, and in that light, unmoving, the shadow of feet. He was standing outside her door. Not entering, not knocking. Just there. She did not know how long he stood there. She did not call out, and he did not knock. But after a while the shadow moved, and the corridor was empty again, and she sat with that knowledge, that the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches had stood outside her door in the dark and said nothing, and tried to decide what it meant, and found that she could not. Not yet. She put herself to bed. She lay in the dark with the fire dying low, and the lavender-scented linen pulled up to her chin, and the kept thought that had been waiting all evening finally arriving. Someone in this keep helped Fenwick map her movements. Someone had watched her be invisible for 4 years, and handed that information to a man who had tried to use it to get a king killed. She did not sleep for a long time, but she did not cry either. She was past the age of crying over things she could not change. What she could do was pay attention. She was very good at paying attention. She would start again in the morning. Morning came in through the window like an accusation. Sadie was already awake when the light arrived, had been awake for the better part of an hour, lying still in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the keep settle into its daytime sounds. The creak of carts in the lower courtyard, the measured steps of the changed guard, the distant clatter of the kitchen beginning its morning work, a sound she knew so well she could identify each stage of it. The first fire, the water, the bread, the argument between the 2 junior cooks that happened every morning without fail, and had been happening every morning for as long as she had worked here. She rose, washed her face in the basin, and stood at the window. The courtyard below was not its usual self. There were more men than a normal morning, not guards in the keep's colors, but men in the darker, more functional dress of the Northern Reaches, Evander's people, moving with the particular economy of motion that marked soldiers who were also shifters. They had taken positions at the gates and along the outer wall, with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before, not replacing the keep's guard, supplementing it, watching it. She understood what she was seeing. Evander did not know yet how deep Fenwick's arrangement went. Until he did, no one who worked for this keep could be fully trusted, and so he had quietly restructured the security around himself while the formal investigation began. She had been correct that the servants' quarters were not safe for her. She had not fully understood until now that the entire keep was, in some measure, still a compromised space. The thought sat with her while she dressed. She had only the clothes she'd worn the previous night, the dress that had been stitched too tight at the shoulder, which she noticed again now with a distant, almost amused recognition. Still wrong. The seam still pulling. She straightened it as best she could and opened the door. The quiet young man was in the corridor. She had begun to think of him as a fixture. He appeared at intervals with the reliability of a well-functioning clock. His name, she had learned from a brief exchange the previous evening, was Corvin. He was Evander's personal aide, which meant he was something considerably more significant than his youth and quietness suggested. "The king will see you after the morning session," Corvin said. "In the meantime, you're not to return to your regular duties." "I understood that," she said. "What am I permitted to do?" He looked briefly as though the question surprised him. Whatever you'd like. You're not confined. Whatever she'd like. She turned that over for a moment. She had not had unstructured time since she was a girl. She had always been moving toward the next task, the next floor, the next tray to carry. The idea of time without assignment felt less like freedom and more like a room with no furniture. Technically spacious, practically uncomfortable. "Is there a library?" she asked. There was. It was on the second floor of the east wing, a long room with high windows and shelves that ran floor to ceiling, accessed by a rolling ladder on a brass rail that she had always noticed from the corridor outside and never been inside. She spent 2 hours there while the formal sessions proceeded in the rooms below, reading nothing in particular with great focus, moving from a territorial history she recognized from references she'd heard in council anterooms, to a treatise on pack law that she found unexpectedly absorbing, to a slim volume on medicinal plants that she picked up because Renfrew's satchel was still in her mind. The entry on the tincture Fenwick had described was there. She found it without much difficulty. It was indexed under compounds affecting shift response and reflex suppression in lupine physiology, which told her something important. The tincture had not been designed to harm Evander directly. It had been designed specifically to suppress the involuntary reflex that a shifter in danger would use without thinking, the half shift that brought enhanced speed and strength in a moment of crisis. Slow his wolf. Leave the man. 5 armed humans against a man whose wolf had been temporarily muffled. It had been a very careful plan. Someone with real knowledge of shifter physiology had designed it. Renfrew had not invented this himself. He had been given the formula. She was still sitting with the open book in her lap when the door opened. She had not heard him coming. She did not know how she had not heard him. The floorboards in this corridor were among the ones that creaked most reliably. But she had not, and he was simply there, leaning against the doorframe with the natural ease of someone who had not needed to announce himself in a long time. Evander looked at the book in her hands. Something in his expression shifted very slightly. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something he had been considering. "The session ran short," he said. 3 of the 5 have already given full accounts. The other 2 will by this afternoon. The formula for the tincture was not Renfrew's, she said. He was given it. Someone with knowledge of lupine physiology prepared it. That someone either trained in pack medicine or with access to a restricted archive. A pause. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, not at the desk, but at the small reading table near the window, as if sitting at a desk would be too formal for whatever this was. The morning light came in at an angle that made the room feel less like a keep chamber and more like a place where ordinary things happened. She was not sure she trusted that. "You read medical texts," he said. "I read whatever is available to me. In 4 years of working the upper floors, I've had access to this library approximately never." She glanced at the shelves. "I'm making use of the situation. Renfrew has already told us the formula came from an outside source," Evander said. "A contact in the Southern Territories, paid through an intermediary that traces back to Fenwick. But the formula itself came from further back. We're working on it." He looked at her. "You identified the vial type from a quarterly inventory. The healers bring their supplies through the lower stores 4 times a year. I've carried the inventory crates. I pay attention to what I carry." "Why?" She considered the question. It was the second time he had asked her a version of it. The first being, "Why didn't you keep walking?" And she was beginning to understand that he was not asking as a matter of suspicion. He was asking because the answer was actually interesting to him. "Because information is the only resource I have ever been able to accumulate," she said. "Everything else in this keep belongs to someone else. The rooms, the linens, the silver on the trays. But what I observe is mine. Nobody can take it from me, and nobody has ever thought to prevent me from having it, because nobody has ever thought it mattered." Evander was quiet for a moment. Then, "It mattered last night." "Yes," she said. "It did." The formal investigation moved quickly. She learned the shape of it, not through any official briefing, but through Corvin, who had the quality of a man who understood that keeping her informed was a functional necessity rather than a courtesy. She had demonstrated that she was a source of useful information, and keeping sources informed maintained them. Fenwick's conspiracy had 3 layers. The outer layer was the 5 men, hired, paid, disposable. The middle layer was the guard captain, 2 members of the keep's senior council, and Renfrew. The inner layer was where it became something larger than a local assassination attempt. Fenwick had not organized this himself. He had been the point of implementation for a plan originated by a lord called Castan, a territorial lord from the southern borderlands who had long opposed Evander's rule and who had, over the course of 3 years, quietly built a network of compromised officials in keeps along the northern route. Ashenvale was not the first attempt. It was the most sophisticated and the most carefully prepared, and it had failed because a maid had almost walked into the wrong alcove at the wrong time. When Corvin told her this, standing in the corridor outside the library with his characteristic economy of words, Sadie felt the full scope of it land in her chest like cold water. This was not simply about Fenwick. This was a territorial conspiracy that had been building for 3 years, and she had been living inside one of its nodes without knowing it, cleaning its floors, carrying its trays, mapping its corridors in the dark. "Lord Castan," she said. "Is he being moved against?" "The king is sending formal notification to the border territories today. Castan will be called to answer before the full council within the fortnight." "He'll run." Corvin looked at her. "He built this over 3 years and kept it hidden," she said. "He's careful. When the notification reaches him, he'll understand that Fenwick failed, and he'll run before the council summons can be enforced. You need someone to move before the notification goes out, or the notification needs to look like something else." Corvin was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he turned and went back down the corridor at a pace that was faster than his usual measured walk. She returned to her book. Evander came back to the library that afternoon. She had half expected it, and half argued herself out of expecting it. And so when the door opened, she was in the same chair with a different book, the Pack Law Treatise, which she had found her way back to, and she looked up with what she intended to be composure and achieved something approximately close to it. He sat in the same chair as before. He had something in his hand, a folded letter, which he set on the table without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "Castan's notification," he said, "will go out as a routine trade agreement inquiry, something that gives no indication of urgency. By the time he understands what it means, the council's enforcement team will already be in position." She had given Corvin the idea 3 hours ago. Evander was telling her that he had used it. She did not know what to do with that. So she did what she did with most things she did not know what to do with. She set it aside and waited for more information. "The investigation will take several more days," he said. "During that time, your situation here remains as it is. The room, the access. When it's resolved, I'll need to address your circumstances more permanently." He said it in the same settled way he said everything, as if the shape of it had already been decided. "You can't return to corridor service. Because of Fenwick. Because of what you did last night." He looked at her with that direct, unornamented attention that she had not yet learned to receive without something tightening in her chest. "You crossed the floor in the middle of a formal ceremony and redirected an Alpha King based on 14 seconds of an overheard conversation. You were correct in every particular. What you did last night required a quality of observation and judgment that does not belong in corridor service." She looked at him for a long moment. "It belongs wherever it is needed," she said. "It's always belonged wherever it was needed. Nobody in this keep simply failed to notice it because they were looking elsewhere. They didn't look at all." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, not sympathy. Something more level than either. A recognition of accuracy. the specific expression of someone who has heard a true thing and is absorbing it. "I know," he said. "That is what I'm attempting to address." The late afternoon light was coming through the high window now, falling across the reading table between them, and the fire in the hearth had been lit while she was reading, and the room smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and underneath both of those, that steadying thing she could not name but kept noticing. She did not let herself settle into it. She noted it, set it aside, and kept her eyes clear. He was powerful, and he had used her information, and he was being, by every available measure, respectful and precise. None of that told her what he wanted. None of that told her whether what he was building here was something she could afford to be part of. She had built her life in the gaps of other people's structures. She was not ready to walk into the center of one without knowing what the walls were made of. "What does addressing it look like?" she asked. He picked up the folded letter from the table, turned it once in his hand. "That depends on what you want." She had not been asked that question in 4 years, possibly longer. She looked at the fire. Outside the window, the courtyard had gone quieter as the afternoon shifted toward evening. Somewhere below, the keep was continuing to function. Meals being prepared, floors being walked, trays being carried by people who would be in the same positions tomorrow and the day after. "I want," she said slowly, "to not be furniture anymore." Evander nodded, as if this were the most reasonable thing he had heard all day. "Then you won't be," he said. The fortnight passed, the way fortnights pass when the world is rearranging itself, too fast in some hours, unbearably slow in others. Sadie remained in the north wing room. She stopped apologizing for it after the 3rd day. When it became clear that no one was waiting for her to leave, and no one had reassigned her corridor duties to someone else. The work simply sat uncovered, and eventually, Corvin told her quietly that Evander had instructed the senior staff, what remained of it after the investigation pulled 3 members into custody, not to reassign her position. It was being held. She did not know what that meant, and she did not ask, because asking felt like reaching for something before she had the right to reach for it. She spent the days in the library and in the small anteroom where Corvin had begun, without formal announcement, to include her in the briefings. Not as a participant, initially just as a presence. She sat at the far end of the table while Corvin and 2 of Evander's senior men discussed the progress of the investigation, and she listened. And on the 2nd day she said something about the intermediary payment route that redirected the inquiry by an afternoon's work. On the 3rd day she was sitting closer to the table. On the 5th day, Corvin was handing her documents to review before the briefing. She noticed the shift. She did not comment on it. She simply did the work. Evander was present for some of the briefings, and absent for others. When he was present, he said little, and listened with that systematic attention she had come to recognize as his primary mode of operation. Gathering, sorting, deciding. When he was absent, she was aware of it the way she was aware of a change in the weather, as a shift in the quality of the air, rather than a specific observation. She did not examine that awareness too closely. What she did examine, carefully and without mercy, was the question of what was happening, and what she was being drawn into. She had spent 4 years building a life that was small and controlled and entirely her own. She had accepted its limitations, because the alternative, wanting more, reaching further, making herself visible, had always felt like a form of exposure she could not afford. And then she had walked past an alcove, and everything had changed. And now she was sitting at briefing tables, and sleeping in a proper room, and being asked what she wanted by a man who ran 11 years of uninterrupted territorial leadership, and apparently found her useful. Useful. That was the word she kept returning to. She was useful to him. Her information, her observation, her knowledge of this keep and its corridors and its supply chains. That was what she was. She knew how to be useful. She had been useful her entire life. the difference between being useful to Fenwick, who had mapped her movements and used them to plan a murder, and being useful to Evander was a difference she believed was real. But belief was not the same as certainty, and certainty was something she had learned to require before she let her guard down. She was sitting with this on the 8th evening, in the library alone after the day's briefing, when Evander came in and sat in his chair and said, without preamble, "Caston is in custody. The enforcement team reached him 2 hours before he attempted to leave his territory." She let out a slow breath. The trade inquiry framing held. Long enough. He set a report on the table. She could see the council seal on the cover. "He will be brought before the full territorial council in 3 days. The charges include conspiracy to assassinate, corruption of territorial officials, and violation of the Northern Accord." He paused. "The Keep's council seats that Fenwick corrupted will be reviewed. New appointments will be made. The Guard will be restructured under new command." Another pause, shorter. "Ashen Vale will need a different kind of administration going forward." She looked at the report, then at him. "You're telling me this because it involves me. I'm telling you this because you're the reason any of it is possible," he said. It was not flattery. It was the same quality as everything else he said, level, accurate, without decoration. 14 seconds in a corridor. Without that, Caston's plan succeeds, and everything that follows from that succeeds with it. 3 more territorial keeps compromised. Pack law dismantled from within. He looked at her steadily. "You are owed a great deal, Sadie." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want a reward," she said. "I know. I'm not offering one. I'm asking what you want to do next." The fire was burning low. The library had gone dark at the edges, the high shelves falling into shadow, only the reading table holding the light. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had carried trays for 4 years, that had sewn dresses by candlelight, that had held a water pitcher steady while she told an Alpha King that he was about to be attacked. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as corridor staff. I don't know yet exactly what shape that takes, but I want—" She stopped. Started again. "I have spent 4 years being the person nobody needed to watch. I would like, going forward, to be the person someone actually sees." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression moved, not dramatically. Nothing that could be described as a sudden change, but a settling. The way a room settles when the last door has been closed and the wind can no longer reach it. "Then stay," he said. The council hearing for Caston took place in the Great Hall. The same hall, the same banners, the same smell of pine resin and beeswax. The same eastern wall where 5 men had come through a tapestry and found themselves surrounded. Sadie stood at the back of the formal gallery, not as a witness in any official capacity, but as a person who had been told she was permitted to be there, and she watched. Caston was a composed man. She had expected something more visibly monstrous, and instead found someone who looked like a minor lord at a trade negotiation. Lean, careful, dressed in the colors of the southern borderlands, with the particular controlled expression of someone who had built a long deception and was not yet ready to relinquish the habit of concealment, even now that the deception had ended. He denied nothing. He also confirmed nothing. He stood in the formal arrangement and offered a performance of dignity that she thought was, in its way, more disturbing than an outright confession. Evander presented the evidence himself. He did not perform it. He did not build to dramatic moments or pause for effect. He simply laid it out. The 3-year timeline, the compromised officials, the formula for the tincture, the payment routes, the 5 men, the configuration of the guard formation, all of it, with the methodical precision of a man who understood that truth, properly assembled, did not require embellishment. When the formal charges were read and the council's verdict rendered, unanimous, which she had expected but still felt as a physical thing, a finality landing in the room, Sadie stood at the back of the gallery and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but something in between. The specific sensation of a thing being finished, completed, the end of something that had been wrong for a long time, finally acknowledged as wrong by people with the authority to say so. Fenwick received his verdict separately, in a smaller chamber, later that afternoon. She was not present for that one. She did not need to be. She had already closed that door. It was Corvin who told her, 3 days after the hearing, that Evander was returning to the northern reaches within the week, and that he had made a formal request for her to accompany him, not as a servant, not as corridor staff, but as an intelligence aide attached to his council. A position that had not previously existed. A position that had apparently been created in the last 10 days specifically because the person it was designed for had not previously existed either. She read the formal document 3 times. Then she set it down on the library table and looked out the window at the courtyard, where the keep's routine had, over the past 2 weeks, slowly re-established itself under the restructured guard. New faces in some positions, familiar faces reassigned, the whole organism of the place recalibrating. She thought about her mother, who had worked the laundry and died of a fever because no healer was summoned. She thought about 4 years of invisible roads and kept observations and a mind full of information that no one had thought to value until a king had looked at her, actually looked at her, and asked what she knew. She thought about the shadow of feet under her door in the dark, standing still, saying nothing, simply present. She thought about, I would like to be the person someone actually sees. She signed the document. The morning they left Ashenvale, the courtyard was cold and sharp, the kind of autumn morning that made the air taste of metal and coming frost. The carriage was already prepared. Corvin was organizing the final arrangements. The keep's remaining senior staff had assembled in the formal courtesy line, as was protocol for the departure of a visiting lord. Sadie came down the main stairs in a coat that was not hers, borrowed from the keep's guest stores, dark wool, well-fitted, carrying nothing except what she had arrived with, which was essentially nothing. She had no baggage. She had no belongings worth the word. She had her observations, her memory, her signed document, and the dress with the seam that was still slightly wrong. She passed through the courtesy line without stopping. The faces of people she had worked beside for 4 years, some of them looking at her with something she could not quite classify, not hostility, more like the expression of people revising a calculation they had made long ago and finding the error. And she met each set of eyes briefly and kept walking. At the bottom of the steps, Evander was standing beside the carriage. He was not watching the courtesy line or the preparations. He was watching her come down the stairs, with that direct, unornamented attention she had stopped trying to deflect a week ago and had simply started allowing, because deflecting it cost energy she preferred to use for other things. She stopped in front of him. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready," she said, "for 4 years." Something moved in his expression then, unmistakably, this time. Not a smile, exactly, but the thing that existed just before one, the private quality of a man who has heard something that pleases him in a way he had not anticipated. He held out his hand, not to take hers, but in the formal offering of assistance into a carriage, palm up, waiting. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She placed her hand in his. The warmth of it moved up her arm and settled somewhere in her chest, and she did not pull away, and he did not make it into something it was not yet. He simply steadied her up the step and released her hand when she was seated, and the carriage door closed, and the wheels began to move. She looked out the window as Ashenvale Keep grew smaller behind her. The gray stone walls, the high windows, the courtyard where she had been invisible for 4 years, the corridors she had walked with her head down and her mind full. She looked at it until it disappeared behind the tree line, and then she faced forward. The road ahead was long. The northern reaches were a week's travel in good weather. She did not know precisely what waited at the end of it. The shape of the new position, the texture of the new life. All the ways she would have to learn a new keep, new corridors, new invisible roads. But she was not invisible anymore. Evander sat across from her in the carriage, reviewing documents in the quiet way he did everything, and after a while he looked up from the papers and found her already watching and said nothing, and she said nothing. And the carriage rolled north through the cold autumn morning, and both of them understood without needing to say it, that something had begun. 6 months later, Sadie stood in the council chamber of the Northern Reaches at Evander's right hand, not behind him, not to the side in the observer's gallery, but at his right hand, at the formal table, with her own set of documents, and her own seat, and her own voice in the proceedings. The council had taken 2 weeks to stop looking at her sideways. Then one of them had made a tactical error in a border assessment that her records had caught before it became a problem, and after that, they stopped looking sideways entirely. Fenwick died in custody 4 months after the hearing, of a genuine illness, confirmed by 2 independent healers, which struck her as an unimpressive ending for a man who had built such a careful architecture of harm. Caston was stripped of his territory and exiled beyond the southern borders, his lands redistributed under the Northern Accord. Renfrew cooperated fully with the investigation and was released under permanent supervision, his practice restricted to the lower territories. The guard captain was sentenced and served his sentence. The 2 junior conspirators were reassigned to distant postings under monitored command. All of it was documented. All of it was closed. On a night in the early spring, when the snow was finally retreating from the peaks above the reaches and the first pale light was returning to the mountain mornings, Evander came to the library. His library, now partly hers, in the way that everything in this place had gradually become partly hers, and sat in the chair across from her and looked at her for a long moment with that steady, undecorated attention, and said, "I need to tell you something." She set down her book. "Then tell me." "You are my mate," he said. "I have known since the corridor at Ashenvale. I didn't say it then because it would have been the wrong thing to say to a woman who had just survived a conspiracy and had no reason to trust anything I offered." He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying it now because you've had 6 months, and you know me, and I would rather you choose it with full information than have you discover it by accident and feel that something was kept from you." The fire was low. The library smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and that thing she had never been able to name. Steadiness. She had finally decided. Steadiness was what it was. The particular scent of a person who did not waver. She had known for 3 months. She had not said it because she was still, in some old, deep, well-practiced part of herself, waiting for the part where it became a tool. Where the warmth was revealed as a strategy, where the regard turned out to be utility in another form. She had been waiting for that. It had not come. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He waited. "I was waiting," she said, "to see if you would tell me yourself or let me discover it." "And?" "You told me yourself." She looked at him across the low fire, this man who had stood outside her door in the dark and said nothing, who had used her ideas without taking credit for them, who had built a position that had not existed before her, who had never once looked through her. "That matters to me." He crossed the room. Not quickly. With the same deliberate quality that marked everything he did. Nothing impulsive, nothing unconsidered. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her. And she looked up at him. And the long, careful distance of 6 months was still there. And also, finally, finished. "Then let it matter," he said quietly. She stood. The space between them closed. Outside, the spring was beginning. The snow was pulling back from the peaks. The morning light was returning. And in the council chamber where she would sit tomorrow with her own documents and her own voice, the seat at the right hand of the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches was waiting for the woman who had once carried trays through invisible corridors and accumulated, in the dark, everything that mattered. She had not been rescued. She had been seen. There was a difference, and it was everything. The fire burned. The keep held its warmth against the mountain cold, and Sadie, who had been furniture, who had been invisible, who had carried 14 seconds of overheard truth through a formal ceremony and changed the shape of the world, chose, with full information and no uncertainty remaining, to stay. It was not the life she had been given. It was the life she had built, piece by piece, in the corridors where no one thought to watch. And it was entirely, completely, irrevocably hers.